if we're going to build the next version of the internet, it needs to be open and a public good, and not a closed for-profit system. The success of the internet comes in large part because although many of the components of it are operated for profit by companies, the internet itself, the protocols and the structure that knits it all together, is not AOL. It's not some centrally operated network where a single operator gets to choose who connects and how it's used and so on and so forth. And so I think that's an absolutely crucial aspect of why the internet succeeded. And if we want to build a successful successor, or even just successful additional infrastructure, we have to follow in its footsteps.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of 0x Research. Before we dive into today's episode, I do want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, Hexens, one of the most hardcore security teams in Web3, pioneering in zk and novel cryptography. Hexens is trusted by tier 1 projects like Polygon, including the work on their new zkEVM, Mantle, RISC-0, Lido, 1inch, Nubank, and others. Today is September 20th, and we have an awesome interview lined up with Nick Johnson, the founder of ENS Labs. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so you're definitely an OG in the space. You've been working at ENS for 6 years now. So I would love to just get a start of what you guys have accomplished and some of the challenges you've run into, and maybe a little peek into what you're building going forward.
Yeah, I'd love to. So as you sort of hinted, I joined less than a year after the launch of Ethereum, which at the time felt late, but doesn't now. And I've been building ENS almost since that point. It was one of the first projects I started working on at the Ethereum Foundation, and then spun out into its own organization, and we've been building it ever since. And I think in terms of what we've accomplished, the main thing is, of course, that ENS is the preeminent decentralized naming service. And I think the fact that we've done that, and that we're credibly neutral, that we're governed by a DAO, that we're minimizing the amount of human governance necessary, and that we're building it as a public good rather than a for-profit company, I think just enhances that accomplishment. So I'm incredibly impressed with what we've achieved. Speaking for myself, obviously biased, but it's only the beginning of what we're working on. And so as we roll out into L2 support and better UX and more functionality, it'll become even more useful for our users.
So I want to dive a little deeper on exactly what the roadmap is for the future. What are the biggest problems that are still kind of being at that pain point for the ENS DAO, and how are you looking to tackle those?
So I think for ENS more broadly, we've always had sort of a 3-stage vision. Every app should use ENS to the point where it's the assumption, when a user comes to it, that they can enter an ENS name anywhere they can enter an address, and that anywhere an address might show up, an ENS name would show up instead. And that they'd be surprised when it isn't supported, rather than having to check that it is. And I think we're close but not there yet for that. Our second vision has always been that every asset can have an ENS name, and that it can be done transparently and cost-free. And that's our big focus at the moment. That's what we're working on mostly, and that work involves rolling out on L2s for low-cost registrations, making it easier for people to issue subnames, making it possible for organizations like Coinbase to use either an L2 or just host names entirely off-chain, and basically giving name owners sort of control over the trust model of how their names are managed and their subdomains are managed and so forth. And so we're focusing on that mostly at the moment by building tooling that makes it easier for people to work on L2. It's been possible to host names on L2 since we launched CCIP Read over a year ago. But what's been missing is the easy plug-and-play tooling that makes it trivial for someone to do that. You don't have to be Coinbase in order to set it up, whereas at the moment, the integration overhead's a bit higher. So that's our main focus on the back end. And then on the front end, it's all corresponding work to make the usability meet the feature set on the back end.
So how does that work from a more technical level? If a user mints a name on an L2, does the ownership reside on the L2, or is it ever settled back down to L1 at any point?
So that's a really good question, and it's one of the biggest things that we have to tackle. So the initial version of our L2 support is you can create a name on L1, and then you can update it and set its records and so forth on L2. So the name still lives on L1. And as an extension of that, you can issue subdomains, and you can give those subdomains to people, and that can all happen on the L2 without touching L1 at all. The caveat for that first iteration is that it won't be trustless in the same way. You're still trusting the owner of the parent name, the second level name, not to rug you, basically. That person has no additional trust assumptions. They can use the L2 without compromising their security, but as a user, you're dependent on them to maintain your subdomain. And that's kind of, that's an acceptable trade-off maybe when your counterparty is Coinbase, for instance, because you're already trusting them with a whole lot of other stuff. Less so when it's some random DGN who bought wallet.eth and wants to issue subdomains. So the next step is providing better functionality for locking things in so that that person can credibly say, I don't have the ability to take your name off you, in the same way that ENS can say that about names in general. And the way we're handling that is by building out this general purpose infrastructure that makes it easy to put your names on L2s. And then we can set it up in a way so that people can effectively commit the power to upgrade things to the DAO, so that the DAO would manage upgrades across the whole ecosystem for anyone that agrees to do that, and therefore remove that node of trust of the owner of the actual name. And of course, you could have other organizations that agree to manage the names as well. It just needs to be made clear in the interface that who it is that you're trusting to maintain your name. And ideally, that's nobody, but the next step down from that is at least it's a large, well-known organization that administers all of ENS anyway.
Okay, really interesting there. And so you also mentioned subdomains in that. And of course, Coinbase launched Coinbase ID. Are there any other groups or entities that are really showing interest? And you don't have to name names, but maybe just like the types of groups and entities that kind of like, hey, that's a really cool idea. If we had that would like really enable this new feature line for us.
Yep. We've been speaking to wallets who want to do this in order to issue subdomains for all their users, which has always been a long-term vision of mine. The wallet sign-up flow should include naming your wallet. You shouldn't have to even know or care what your Ethereum address is any more than you do what your IP address is. And we've chatted with other exchanges that are interested in following in Coinbase's shoes. We're also not at the subdomain level, but at the top level domain level, we've had interest from various TLDs who want to either launch on ENS or add ENS functionality to their existing DNS names.
Interesting. Okay, so zooming out a little bit too, like you say, one of the primary goals, what you want to achieve is to be able to name any asset, give any asset an ENS domain name. So what are the actual benefits for the users on that front? Like, why should I care that that's possible?
I mean, I think the primary one is usability. Like if I asked you what Google's IP address was, you couldn't tell me because there's no reason you would know that, and there's no reason you would want to know that. And IP addresses are a lot shorter than Ethereum addresses. They're a lot easier to memorize. And so really the same degree of usability ought to apply to Ethereum, to crypto in general. And so when you sign up for a wallet, you ought to be able to pick a name. Ideally, it should be, that it can be pseudonymous and disconnected from all your other wallets too. So the fact you're naming it doesn't mean you're doxing yourself. It just means you're providing some sort of handle to identify it. And ultimately, we create accounts because we want to transact with them. And so at some point, that involves giving that address to someone else or some, third party or site or whatever. And this just makes that an order of magnitude easier.
Right. So you mentioned the wallet piece there as well, and just like really simplifying the user experience. But please correct me if this is wrong. But my current understanding is that the resolving an ENS name has to actually happen at the wallet level. It's not actually happening at the protocol level, right? So if I pulled up the CLI interface, I couldn't just send ETH to nick.eth. What are the kind of issues around that? And, do you think ENS has maybe grown to a size where it's actually worse UX for the application to not support the names rather than the other way around?
You're right. ENS resolution does take place at the application layer, which isn't to say you couldn't have a command line interface that does it, of course, but, it does happen in the apps. And we've worked with Ethers and Web3.js and so on to push that down the stack as much as possible. So, if you're building an app on top of Ethers and you use, Ethers address fields anywhere, they'll accept ENS names anywhere they accept addresses. So often if an app doesn't support ENS, it's actually more because they were ignorant of the ability to do so than because they had to expend any particular effort to add support for it. A protocol with naming built in at the base layer would look quite different from Ethereum. And so ultimately, having made the choice that Ethereum is the system to build on and is the platform, building it on top of Ethereum rather than in Ethereum was the best bet. I'm a little ambivalent about whether it would be a better system if, whether Ethereum would be a better protocol if it had naming at the base layer. There are sort of pros and cons. It introduces a lot of, protocol layer complexity. And again, drawing the parallel to IP addresses, the internet does pretty well with naming being an add-on. It's just so universal that it looks like part of the basic infrastructure.
Yeah, I love that perspective there. I think that makes a ton of sense, and I really like your approach as well of saying, okay, well, let's not push it down the protocol stack itself, but rather the development stack, and just getting it in the hands of making it easier for developers to use it, and as a result, it kind of is this widely adopted platform, which is just really exciting to see. And so, I want to talk a little bit about the DAO itself and kind of how you think about DAOs as a whole. So, after working in a DAO for 6 years, are you bullish on DAOs and their format and the ability to be decentralized and have everybody have these like active opinions? Or does the decentralization aspect stagnate growth too much or create too many roadblocks?
So first, I guess I should disclaim I've only been working in a DAO for about 2 years because when ENS launched, it was administered by multisig. And, the sort of gradual decentralization has always been the roadmap. I'm of two minds about it. Like, I think the ENS DAO has done a pretty damn good job, but also there is the inevitable sort of decentralization effect, friction that it generates in terms of making decisions and so forth. I think DAOs are a lot better at reactive stuff. So somebody comes to them with a protocol upgrade or whatnot, and they discuss the merits and decide to implement it, than they are proactive stuff like planning roadmaps and things like that. And so for that reason, I think it makes sort of the division we've got makes a lot of sense, where you have a DAO and then you have one or more development orgs who basically come to the DAO and say, here's the cool stuff we can do, fund us. And, as long as they're credible, they get funded. And the fact that you don't just have to have one of those and that the DAO can independently decide which organizations they're going to fund makes it a lot more meaningfully decentralized than just having the company run things directly. It also means that any actual changes still have to go by the DAO, which again is the reactive aspect, where I think DAOs are quite good at sort of assessing changes and approving them and acting as a safety valve effectively.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I love to hear your perspectives on DAOs. I feel like, no one really has a silver bullet for the right way to operate one. And I'm glad to see that you guys are doing some kind of innovative attempts at being more efficient. But in the same vein, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on public goods funding? I feel like that's been a pretty hot topic as of late, especially with the rise of like the OP stack, Coinbase contributing sequence of revenue or profit to public goods funding. Do you have a strong opinion there?
If we're going to build the next version of the internet, it needs to be open and a public good, and not a closed for-profit system. The success of the internet comes in large part because although many of the components of it are operated for profit by companies, the internet itself, the protocols and the structure that knits it all together, is not AOL. It's not some centrally operated network where a single operator gets to choose who connects and how it's used and so on and so forth. And so I think that's an absolutely crucial aspect of why the internet succeeded. And if we want to build a successful successor, or even just successful additional infrastructure, we have to follow in its footsteps. And so I think having well-funded public goods is essential. I think having a route to actually funding the public goods in the first place, to be able to say, here is this really important thing, everyone agrees we need it, will somebody pay for it? And actually the answer being yes, rather than just everyone sitting on their hands, is crucial. And ENS is in a particularly good position to help push this forward because we have registration fees. They're necessary as part of the protocol. If we didn't have registration fees, you'd expect every name would be snapped up instantaneously, and anyone coming along after would be out of luck. And so we have to charge the fees, and then we have a treasury. And what do we do with the treasury? Well, part of what we do is pay for development and operation of the DAO and the development org and so forth. But that leaves rather a lot left over. And I think the most responsible thing is to contribute it back to other public goods that maybe don't have that same funding stream or are earlier in their life cycle and still building up.
I want to give a quick shout out to Hexens. As we explore today's blockchain landscape, let's take a moment to recognize them as a premier cybersecurity provider in Web3. Hexens is trusted by tier 1 projects like Polygon, including a security review on their new Polygon zkEVM, Mantle, RiskZero, Lido, 1inch, Nubank, and more. Get a deep dive into your technology stack with the most comprehensive analysis and cybersecurity consulting. Hexens not only uses widely known methodologies and flows, but discovers and introduces new ones on a day-to-day basis. With over $55 billion secured, they cover everything from smart contracts to blockchain to Web2 pen tests.
Yeah, there's been nearly $7 billion of total value hacked in crypto's nascent history, so it's safe to say your team has a lot on the line. Don't skimp out, take your security seriously, and reach out to Hexens. Don't forget to mention 0x Research for a free Web2 pen test with your partnership, and reach out to Hexens at hexens.io. Find them in the links in the show notes, or reach out to them at Permissionless. They'll be at booth 832. But without further ado, let's get back to today's episode.
Glad you brought up the registration fees there, because if you amortize the registration fees over the life of the registration period, right? So if someone paid, let's just make up a number here, $100 for a 5-year registration, and you take that and divide it evenly across the registration period on a monthly basis. So if you use that calculation across all of the registrations to date, you actually are still like the revenue fees are not small, right? This is a couple $1 million a month. And so you do have a lot of firepower to kind of make those changes. The other side of the camp would probably come in and say, hey, you guys are making a ton of money. This should be a business. Let's turn on the revenue switch. Like, what is your mindset around that discussion?
I mean, ENS was built explicitly as a public good and not as a business. And when we launched the DAO, we set some really strong norms about that. We asked people to vote on a constitution that enshrined its effectively non-profit status. Over 95% of people, I think, agreed to those clauses in the constitution. And we did our best to make it very clear, like, you can claim your airdrop regardless of how you vote on this. We want your honest opinion, should ENS continue in this vein. I think there is a very, very strong social and governance norm towards ENS continuing to be a public good. I certainly would be strongly opposed to any attempt to sort of extract value, and partly that's because of my belief that public goods are essential, and partly because it's down to my belief that once you start extracting value from systems like this, you look for ways to make them more profitable, but not necessarily more useful. They're only more useful in service of the profit, and so. Sometimes that works, with some things that's, well, we'll make a better, more popular product. With other things, it's, well, everyone's locked in, we can double the fees. And so I'm really concerned about the sort of incentives that pop up once you start doing that. And I'd rather move in the other direction of abstracting away human control where it's not necessary and limiting it to the upgrades and the levers and so on that are absolutely crucial to have, than going the other way.
Interesting. Okay, so I remember Vitalik dropped a blog post about a year ago on ENS's pricing model and revenue model, if you will, and he wanted to incorporate like a demand-based pricing aspect, if I'm recalling correctly. It's been a while since I read it. Did anything come of that? And I'm a little bit surprised because it does sound like you're like very much in the same ethos as Vitalik was in that article, but maybe you just think about revenue differently.
I think Vitalik and I see eye to eye on a lot of stuff, including public goods and a lot about ENS. The discussion was all about, like you say, demand-based pricing, and the issue there is, how do you implement that in a way that isn't easily abused, that actually honestly reflects it and its usefulness and so forth. And by it I mean the domain. And It's really tough. I haven't seen a proposal yet, including Vitalik's, that I believe is robust enough that it would be a viable alternative to just simple flat rate pricing, because you can easily think of scenarios where the value of the name to the owner is actually, or the value they accrue by actually owning it is much lower than the sort of value it has to other people. So you can imagine a scenario where, say, you imagine evil Coinbase and they own cb.eth, and they give out subdomains for free to all their users, and so the value to them is the value of their reputation, effectively, on continuing to act honestly. But the value to someone else of owning cb.eth might be, now we can rug every single Coinbase user, evil Coinbase user. And so evil Coinbase might go, well, hey, here's how we can get a really great Q3 earnings report. We'll sell this subdomain, and that requires almost like a cartoonishly evil organization. But in a situation where you have Harberger-based tax pricing and so forth, you almost automate that, because the people who could make a huge amount of profit off, defrauding every Coinbase user can now effectively bid up the cost of maintaining cb.eth. And if they bid it up to the point where Coinbase can't afford it because they don't make revenue relative to the number of users using it and the amount of a fraud you could conduct if you took the name, then they lose it. And the people who lose out the most aren't evil Coinbase, they're the people who actually were using those subdomains. So I think the big problem with all of these schemes is they don't really account for the fact that the value of the name to its users might not be the same as the value of the name to arbitrary others.
So it's kind of hitting home at the point of like squatters or snipers, as they're kind of commonly referred to. And so I think you push forward the idea of like ENS Fairy. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is and kind of how that would attempt to mitigate some of these issues?
Sure. The ENS Fairy is basically just a cooperation to try and get names to the people that they make sense for. I think one of the best ways to measure the success of a naming system is sort of the principle of least surprise. If you pick a popular name of some kind and enter it, does it resolve to the entity you expect it to? And the more often that's true, the better the naming service is. And so, short of some like automatic way to do that, which is hugely problematic, ENS Fairy is kind of just doing that on an individual volunteer basis, by doing their best to acquire names that clearly represent one organization, and then getting the names to that organization or person or whatever it be, and just effectively donating them to the people that would use them for their intended purpose.
So that kind of opens up Pandora's box in some regard, right? Because it's like, how do you define the rightful owner? So talk to us about like the challenges of that. And like, okay, maybe there's, let's say that a company or a big brand in America was also a big brand in some Eastern country, and there was no relation between the two brands at all. Like, how do you define who's the rightful owner of this term?
I think that gets right to the heart of why you can't easily automate or enforce a system like this. It really only works in the context of ENS Fairy because it's being done on a voluntary basis, and because they're doing it for names that are fairly unambiguous, and really getting it to any one of the people it reasonably represents is a win over it being unused. Whereas if you tried to build some sort of system that arbitrates who should own each name, then you get into that tar pit that you just described, where if you have apple.eth, does it go to Apple Music or Apple Records or your local orchard? There's really no perfect answer, and you kind of need a perfect answer. Otherwise, Apple Music or Apple computers are going to come after you and sue you for giving it to the wrong person.
And I feel like that kind of also wraps in with the idea of like unlimited registrations, because these squatters or snipers will come in and just like grab an S tier name, if you will. Like, let's keep using the Apple example. You grab that, register it for 500 years, which is effectively forever. Then they kind of can have the ability to be like, all right, well, either you never get it or you pay me. And how do you think about the idea of like limiting or shortening registration periods or something along that nature?
There's sort of two reasons that I think indefinite registration is a problem. One is what you described. Effectively, it reduces the cost to squatters because they know they can acquire a portfolio and then sit on it forever. There's no incentive for them to to relinquish names that aren't performing, that nobody wants. They can just sit on it. There's really no cost to them. And I should distinguish here, squatters versus speculators, because in my mind, a squatter is buying a name that they clearly know represents one other person, or that is not a generic name, and attempting to effectively extort the owner of that name for to purchase it off them. A speculator is buying up, say, John.eth, and is like, well, there's 10,000 Johns out there, one of them will want it. And I feel personally a lot better about speculation than I do about squatting, because I feel like squatting it's basically a tax on being late. And in an entirely anarchistic system, that may be okay, but I'd much rather our system, as I say, be less surprising. So I think it's a problem for that reason. It's also a problem because names get lost. That people will acquire names and then lose their credentials, and eventually, a big part of your name space just becomes permanently inaccessible. And you can get around that by having regular pings or whatever to retain the name, but it's kind of just discount renewals. It doesn't really feel like a big difference. I think regular registration fees are a good trade-off because they impose a cost on holding a name that isn't hugely significant if you have your name, but is if you have 20,000 names that you're hoping to profit off. It sets a lower bound on how much of a namespace you can afford to sit on. I don't think necessarily limiting a maximum duration is useful, because for it to be meaningful, the maximum duration would have to be fairly high, call it like a decade. And at that point, it's long enough that I think it's difficult to say that it's having a big effect on the availability of names, in the short term. I quite like the fact that in ENS you can effectively, make a name immortal or close to immortal, because there's no fixed limit on registrations. I've even mooted in the past on the DAO, what if we discounted longer registrations, on the theory that a speculator is likely to only want to retain the name for a couple of years while they try and sell it. And if it hasn't sold after that long, they probably don't want it. The remaining registration duration on a name doesn't seem to have a big effect on how much it sells for. So if we made it really cheap to register, for 100 years compared to registering for 2, maybe only 5 times as much, then people who actually want to keep the name would be incentivized to do that, and the speculators would still pay the same price, so you'd get a more useful system. Safe to say I'm not, that opinion isn't universally held, so it wasn't uncontentious enough that I felt it was worth really fighting for.
And just to kind of hammer home on that point, what is the current pricing model? So if I wanted to register a name for 1 year or 100 years, is the 100-year option just actually 100x more expensive than the 1 year?
It is, yeah. So it's $5 a year for 5+ character names, 160 a year for 4 character names, and 640 a year for 3 character names. And those prices for shorter names are kind of a bit of a brute force solution to the fact that there's just not very many of those names. And if they were $5 each, that'd all be set on forever.
And you all were thinking about adding, and maybe you already have, so forgive me if I'm off here, but 1 and 2 characters?
Mm-hmm. We haven't. It's always a possibility. Just like it's a contract upgrade, it's definitely doable. I think that 1 and 2 character names are so rare that we can't just be like, oh, okay, they're $1,000 a year or whatever, there's some outrageous amount. We probably need a distinctly different approach to administering those names that recognizes that, particularly the single character names are always going to be in extremely short supply.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're pretty much just kind of promoting speculation under that scenario, most likely. But that's part of the game, right?
I don't want a situation where Coinbase can afford the 5-figure fee to have cb.eth, but
Mhm.
nobody else can have something distinctive because it's just way too expensive for them either, or the flip side where they're cheap enough that they're all instantly on the secondary market.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense to me. I'm also curious. I want your opinion. I feel like airdrops have been a pretty controversial topic. Like no one really knows how effective they are. In hindsight, the way you guys distributed ENS, would you double down on that same exact strategy, or would you go about it a different way, knowing what you know today?
If I could repeat what we did when we did it, I would do the same thing more or less, with some minor tweaks. If we were doing it today, I wouldn't. I think ENS was really fortunate in that we actually got in right at the tail end of when it was practical to do this without it being completely botted and farmed. We were starting to see speculative airdrop farmers, right as we were getting ready to launch. And if we'd launched a year later, even without any hint that we were going to launch a DAO beforehand, I think it would have been much more gamed and much less practical. I do think if you can identify meaningful metrics, that represent actual users of your service, then being able to airdrop to them gives you a massive leg up as opposed to just a basic usage metric. And sort of the less expected the metric is, the better. So I think we did quite well, for instance, in that a large part of the airdrop was determined by how long you'd held, how many days you had held at least one ENS name for. And so it's extremely difficult to sort of bot that because you'd have to go back in time and register, right from the launch of ENS. And at the same time, it doesn't reward people for owning 10 or 100 or 1,000 names. It's just how long have you been part of the ecosystem? So it's a difficult measure to forge. It's also not necessarily one people would have expected to be measured on. And therefore, I think it worked pretty well at targeting people who actually used ENS.
And one of the core messages around the airdrop was, hey, we're distributing responsibility in the form of governance over this public good. Is that still really the core thesis behind the ENS token itself, is to hey, this is ownership over this public good and the distribution of the treasury to go
Very
fund
much
those
so.
public goods?
Yeah, very much so. And so, if somebody does, something that's worthy of a grant in the ENS DAO, they'll often be granted some amount of Ether or fiat currency, USDC or whatnot, for the work, and then also some number of ENS tokens, basically saying, now you have more of a voice in the ecosystem. And we treat those quite differently, and we try and assess them on their merits. What was this worth in terms of governance voice, and also how much should we pay them? Those are two different variables.
And going over to kind of user metrics and adoption, you may not know this off the top of your head, but how many ENS domains, are out there in user wallets? And have you seen a specific, downfall in activity as a result of the bear market? Or do you think it's people losing interest in the domain kind of narrative? What would you chalk up the decline in usage to?
I know we're up over 2 million, but I don't know what the actual number is right now. We've seen a tapering off in interest, but not as much as I would have expected, I guess. It reflects the general downtrend in activity on crypto, in recent times. But there's still a great deal of activity. As you alluded to, the registration and renewal revenue continues to be pretty strong. I think, mostly it reflects the market as a whole rather than, ENS specifically. There's also just a tendency for people to glom on to whatever's new and shiny, at any given time. And while we continue to release new and shiny things, ENS as a whole is generally viewed as fairly stable and well known.
And speaking of new and shiny things, the V3 name manager was recently highly discussed. And so I'd love to get your take on what that enables and how that powers the next generation of users using ENS names.
I think the main way to think about it is it's just the UX is a lot better for end users and really in general. We stepped back and we looked at target users and looked at all the things we wanted to enable and really rebuilt it from the ground up with those sort of flows in mind, and so the main thing it enables is just actually doing the things you could technically do previously, but were maybe quite fiddly to do, or just it was unclear to end users how that worked. the app is in a difficult spot, really, because we have a lot of users who are very goal focused. All they really want to do, understandably, is go in, set their name up, and leave. And then maybe come back in a year to update their profile or something. Or 6 months or whatever. At the same time, though, the app really needs to support all the functionality that ENS enables. I've always been quite adamant that we need to do that, because we don't look particularly credible if we build a system with advanced functionality that you have to go to some third-party app in order to actually use. There are limits to this. If you're writing your own, code and deploying it and so on, then we can't provide a complete interface for it. But we're still trying to serve those two user groups. And so I think, our front-end team have done a pretty astonishing job of enabling all of that without cluttering up the interface and making it difficult to understand for people who just want to accomplish that one thing.
And is the goal of the app really to kind of be like I don't know if like Rolodex is the right term, but I guess that's a better question. Is what is the vision for the app? Like, how do you want users to ultimately interact with this?
I think it's less like a Rolodex and more like your decentralized profile page. So, it's you editing your card in someone else's Rolodex in a way. You can use ENS to look up other names, of course, and to view their profiles and so on. But that's more or less a secondary aspect of it. We expect that most people will be viewing other people's ENS details via the apps that integrate it. Whereas when you're visiting the app, it's mostly you're there to update something that you own.
And also following up here, how do you think about building a UI that's mobile first versus desktop first? That's like kind of a lot of apps in crypto today are desktop first, but a lot of users want to be mobile first is what it kind of seems like the narrative is. So I'm curious, is that the same realization that you guys are thinking about?
Yeah, I think when we rebuilt it, we built it with mobile as a first-class citizen. I'm not sure whether I'd say mobile first or desktop first, but rather than, we recognize we have a large user base in both camps. And there is a reasonable mapping between mobile users are mostly just wanting to achieve the thing, and desktop users are mostly wanting to do something more sophisticated. But I don't know about you, but I get incredibly frustrated when I go to the mobile version of some site and half the functionality is missing. So we really wanted to avoid that as much as possible. In large part, our astonishing front-end team did most of this, and they didn't ask me whether it should be mobile or desktop first, because they had a much better handle on it than me. That's their expertise. I'm very much a back-end guy.
Yeah, sometimes you just gotta let the people who know what they're talking about do it. So I totally feel that. I do that every day.
That's been one of the hardest things to cope with growing. That for the longest time we were 4 or 5 people, and although I wasn't doing the front-end development, I was talking daily with the people that do, and we were all, working with each other very closely. And as Labs has grown, that's no longer the case. We're still not a huge organization by any means, but we're no longer small enough that that's the case. And it's been a bit jarring at times to realize, oh, hey, this entire initiative happened, and it's great, but I had no involvement with it. It's weird.
That probably feels like magic, honestly. Wow, that thing actually just...
Yeah, no, especially when that is stuff that I previously did myself, and now somebody who is actually an expert at that is doing it rather than me.
That actually feels like a superpower of a DAO, right? So, ENS Labs is now not the sole developing team of the ENS DAO. They're just a core contributor to or a service provider of the larger DAO. And we've actually seen a number of DAOs kind of trend in this direction, right? If you think about Aave, for example, like BGD Labs, Gauntlet, Chaos Labs, there's all these different service providers that are all using their expertise to help better the DAO. Is that kind of the way you see DAOs as a whole progressing? Is not necessarily like individuals coming in and helping, but I don't even know if I want to say professionalized groups of service providers?
I think that is the best way to structure a DAO. I think trying to pretend a DAO as a company with a reporting hierarchy and individuals doing work and working closely together, is a recipe for sort of a morass, where nothing really gets done because you've got this decentralized hierarchy trying to pretend to be management. This approach with development orgs and so forth is much better. But I also think it's worth emphasizing that, it doesn't have to be some large company. It can literally be a guy who is like, here is a cool thing I think needs building. Here is my one pager of why it's worth building and why I'm the guy to do it. How about some funding to get started? And I'll come back in a week and show you the MVP. They do enable that sort of thing. And at their best, we should be really encouraging that sort of thing by making sure it's very easy to get started. It's easy to get a little bit of money and a little bit of time to show that what you've got here is valuable, instead of a lot of bureaucracy that is really can only be overcome by larger organizations.
I've got a question for you kind of out of left field. Friend Tech has gotten a ton of attention, and obviously it's in a very different category than ENS, but I'm just curious your general thoughts on that primitive.
So I initially had really sort of squeaky vibes from it because of its predecessor, whose name I can't remember now, but the other one that was trading on people's profiles. BitCloud, thank you. And so my initial reaction was haven't we done this before and didn't we all hate it? And so for that reason, I didn't really look at it right at the start, and now I feel like it's too late to really spend a lot of time on it. The feedback I've seen on crypto Twitter has generally been positive. It does seem mostly like a kind of a fun speculative game rather than perhaps a lasting thing, but we'll see.
And keeping the left field questions coming to you. So I'm curious on your thoughts on the identity layer of crypto. And really what I mean by that is the layer that bridges the gap between, say, your physical world identity, so me as Dan Smith versus me as a hexadecimal address on chain. And what do we need from that layer? Because it's kind of got to thread the needle between privacy and accountability. So how do you think about that as a whole?
I think, the whole threading the needle conversation it's largely a matter of we need to make pseudonymous identity and separating different facets of your identity from each other easier in general. That's not unique to naming, but naming does make it much more obvious. All of the crypto analysis stuff that goes on to link accounts together and so on doesn't rely on ENS names to make it possible. It all works in a world without names. But when you throw a name on something, it immediately tells some people somebody thought of it as this, somebody thought of this account as Nick.eth, and so it immediately sort of provides an identity, which is in that sense is a double-edged sword. But in a world where we can more easily maintain separate identities and have software that enables that by making it possible to make anonymous transfers between facets of our identities, makes it possible for us to keep track of who we're interacting as, and that we're not accidentally sort of cross-contaminating. It becomes much more sort of voluntary and consent-based, I guess, and that you can decide who you present, which identity you're presenting. Which really isn't that much different to say how social media logins like Twitter work. With the exception of Twitter, nobody knows when I'm logged in as my alt that it's my alt, and yet somehow when we do that on chain, it's suddenly contentious. The Netherlands arrests people for trying to build equivalent privacy to Twitter. So ultimately, I think usernames and profiles and naming systems have to work hand in hand with better on-chain privacy in order to enable any of that. I don't think it's possible to build it just at the naming layer because there's so many more levels to it.
Would ENS ever want to expand deeper into those levels, or just let's focus on the naming layer, let's kind of own that space and try to be the best there?
I think that pretty much sums it up. I would enthusiastically support better primitives for financial privacy and build functionality that supports them in ENS. But I don't think it's our job to be pioneering that.
Okay, that's super interesting, right? Because I can see why a large entity, whoever it may be, would be like really interested in owning that stack. It could be fairly profitable if you were like more of a corporation, or it could be a very beneficial thing if you were more of a public goods focused service, right? And so my initial guess would be like, oh, like that could be something Coinbase would be interested in doing. But the fact that they're actually leveraging ENS is kind of nice, right? Because you don't have to worry about, oh, these guys might actually kind of like eat our service because they're a large corporation that's well funded. They might be able to just go do it. So how do you think about expanding the partnerships around that and like being like, okay, if someone else is going to build this, like let us be your name layer. Like don't go bother trying to rebuild that. Like only go focus and like drive that attention towards the other pieces of the stack.
I think what you've hit on is pretty much our strategy when it comes to talking to all of these other protocols and platforms. You really don't want to invent naming from scratch. We've spent 6 years doing it. What we've built is independent. It's not like tied to one platform or application. It's not, you don't have to pay for access. Integrate that and focus on your key strength. And so I think that applies for things like, decentralized social media and things like that. I forget what your initial question was because I was so enthusiastic about agreeing with that statement.
That was basically it. As if you agreed was ultimately the question there. And so when it comes to like privacy as a whole, that's like such an unopened can of worms. I think Wei Dai actually recently gave a talk at this around ECC's time frame where he was like, we need, first of all, before you can even like go do these things, we need to better understand what we want from privacy, because maybe like a country in the West might want something very different from what a country in the East might want. And how do you build an open source blockchain that both countries are interacting with to kind of get that balance? So I guess ultimately my question here is, how do you think about privacy concerns related to around like segregating your identity to two different pieces on chain? Like how do you think about that?
I think ultimately it's I'm probably wrong about this, but I feel like ultimately it's relatively straightforward in that we need systems and tools that make it easy for us to create multiple pseudonymous identities and to choose how they interact with the world and with each other. And right now, those are vastly lacking, partly because of the lack of privacy in on-chain transactions, but also partly because our wallets and apps don't make it obvious to us when we're about to link two of our identities together by accident by sending transactions that make that obvious. I don't think it's an unreasonable request to be able to have multiple wallets in the Ethereum sense any more than you have multiple wallets in the cash sense, or that I can show up to a dairy where they know me as Bob because I told them I'm Bob. You do that and nobody comes after you to arrest you for fraud, because it's just we all interact differently in different environments. And I think and a system like this doesn't have to be intrinsically hostile to law enforcement, to reasonable provisions for investigation and things like that. The ironic thing about the whole mess around Tornado Cash is that Tornado Cash actually built provisions into their base layer protocol to allow people to voluntarily link their inputs and outputs. So you could still KYC yourself to an organization if you'd used Tornado Cash. You could present a cryptographic proof that says, yes, that money that came out of Tornado Cash, it came from this other account of mine. Here's the proof. And if only those things had actually been adopted, that's actually a really legitimate way to provide on-chain privacy and so on, without this threat of enabling money laundering and all that sort of stuff. You can just say, only the people I want to know the connection.
That is incredibly interesting. I did not know that fact about Tornado Cash. I'm glad you shared that one.
Practically nobody does, it seems, including law enforcement. And as I say, it's frustrating because it means that when you need to prove that connection, you can, which is exactly the scenario you want. And it's the same scenario you get with like a bank account, except that it's the bank that the cops go to ask for that connection. Whereas in this case, it's you who can provide that as necessary.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Looking over the situation in hindsight, and yeah, that was a key piece of info I feel like everyone on crypto Twitter was missing. But putting a bow on this conversation and kind of tying it up as we're coming up on an hour. I want to be respectful of your time, but are there any specific projects that are leveraging everything that ENS has built to date, or maybe some that you guys have funded through public goods that you're particularly excited about?
I mean, there's a lot. The first ones that come to mind immediately are Namebase, which has been doing an amazing job, making it easier for people to issue subnames and building tech on top of that. And the various other marketplaces and stuff like ENS Vision and so on that have basically taken ENS functionality and made it the core of their product. I think things like DM3, which is an on-chain notification and messaging system that have integrated ENS at the core layer, demonstrates how useful it is to have a decentralized naming service that can be the foundation of other bits of infrastructure. And then, of course, there's organizations like Coinbase and so on who have decided to make ENS the core of their digital identity. Those are the ones that come immediately to mind at any rate.
I also have one last question, and Dan, I'll kick it over to you in case you do too. But I feel like when ENS, around the time that you guys dropped a token, it was like a huge wave. I feel like every week I was getting spam in Twitter for like a new ENS ripoff, essentially. Do you think you guys are at the point now? Like, would you say that you've established enough network effects that, you're kind of the go-to naming service? Or I know it's the open source nature of crypto, but just how do you feel about, 18 different naming services on every single chain?
Yeah, I think I think that is a pretty accurate recap of history, and I do think that yes, now we are the one that people compare everything else to, in effect. And that doesn't mean that those clones have stopped popping up, but they seem increasingly obvious as cash grabs rather than actual honest attempts to build a naming system. And I'm not saying that you can't build a better naming system than ENS, or that it's too late, or that it has to be a cash grab, but it's mostly what I've seen have been attempts to mirror ENS's success by just cloning it rather than building on top of it. And I kind of wish that wasn't true because, while I hope ENS succeeds, I hope we succeed by innovating and building the best tech and getting the best ideas, not just by virtue of being the only one.
Yeah, I love that approach as well. And Nick, I just want to thank you for taking the time to come out on the show. This was a great conversation. Really awesome to hear kind of your thoughts from the trenches of how you've been building this product and why you're building it and what's to come next. So thanks again, Nick. And also as a user of blockchains, I would like to thank you for your product, because improving the UX is something we desperately need to continue building. So thank you, sir. And if you could just leave the audience with where they can find more about ENS and follow you, hear more about your thoughts as well.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to talk with you. You can find me on Twitter at Nick SD Johnson, and you can find ENS at ENS Domains and at ENS.domains. Just before I go, I should apologize to the Namesys team, because the app I was thinking of is Namesys, not Namebase. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a ton, Nick. And we'll include all those links in the description. But thanks again. Cheers.
Thank you.